Napoleon Bonaparte was French. That is the story. It has been repeated across 400 biographies, taught in schoolrooms on every continent, and encoded into mythology of the modern Western world. A Frenchman who became an emperor, a revolutionary soldier who remade Europe in his own image. The story begins in almost every telling with France. It does not begin with a reliquary. In the Bertrand Museum of the city of Châteauroux in central France, there is a small medieval-style case, gilded copper, late 15th century in form, assembled by a man named Dominique Vivant Denon, whom Napoleon himself appointed as the first director of the Louvre Museum. Denon was a collector of relics. The case holds a beard of Henry IV of France, a tooth belonging to Voltaire, and, in the right lateral compartment, a lock of Napoleon Bonaparte's hair, alongside 3 hairs from his beard, still bearing microscopic traces of the iron shavings from the razor that cut them. The hair in that case is authenticated by Napoleon's own signature on a letter also kept inside, addressed to Denon personally. That reliquary is the object at the center of this investigation. Hold it in your mind. What was extracted from it over the course of several years of scientific work, beginning in 2011 and continuing through 2015, produced a result that placed Napoleon's paternal ancestry not in France, not in Corsica, and not among the minor Italian noblemen his family claimed to be descended from. It pointed somewhere far older and far further away. We will reach the coordinates in a few minutes. Stay with this. The evidence is worth the time. The accepted history of Napoleon Bonaparte's origins is not simple, but it is familiar. He was born on the 15th of August 1769 in Ajaccio, the capital of the island of Corsica, 1 year after the Republic of Genoa ceded the island to France under the Treaty of Versailles. His father, Carlo Maria Bonaparte, was a Corsican lawyer who had briefly fought for Corsican independence under the nationalist leader Pasquale Paoli before making his peace with French rule and leveraging his connections to secure opportunities for his children. His mother, Maria Letizia Ramolino, was known throughout her life for a severity of character that Napoleon would later credit with shaping everything in him. The Bonaparte family, by every account given during Napoleon's rise and reign, were minor Tuscan nobility who had emigrated to Corsica in the 16th century. Their origins were placed in Sarzana, a small town on the border between Liguria and Tuscany, and then traced further back, through careful genealogical citation, to the minor propertied families of central Italy. This was the official story. Italian in origin, Corsican by birth, French by education and ambition. Napoleon himself moved to mainland France at the age of 9, enrolled in military academies, and rose through the ranks of the French Revolutionary Army with extraordinary speed. By the time he crowned himself emperor in December 1804, placing the crown on his own head at Notre Dame de Paris, the Bonaparte name had been Francified into Bonaparte. The Italian given name Napoleon had been smoothed into Napoleon, and the lineage of the family had been fitted, by those around him, into the larger mythology of European imperial legitimacy. The first crack in this story is not loud. It is linguistic. Napoleon was born Napoleon D. Bonaparte. The shift from Bonaparte to Bonaparte was not accidental or gradual. It was a deliberate act of identity construction, executed as Napoleon rose through the revolutionary military ranks and understood what his name needed to sound like in order for France to accept him. The Italianate surname was Gallicized. The Corsican accent, which his schoolmates had mocked at Brienne, was disciplined into formal French. The man who would remake Europe remade himself first. The second crack runs deeper. It runs through the genetic record, and it was found by a researcher who was not looking for it. Gerard Lecoq was not, in the early 2010s, investigating Napoleon Bonaparte's identity. He was working within the broader field of historical DNA authentication, the practice of extracting biological material from authenticated relics and establishing genetic profiles of historical figures, with the goal of determining family relationships and confirming the provenance of disputed artifacts. The Napoleon I Genome Project, which he led to the Institute of Molecular Anthropology in Paris, grew from a narrow technical question. Could DNA be reliably extracted from the beard hairs inside the Vivant Denon reliquary? And if so, could they confirm that those hairs genuinely belonged to the emperor? The authentication chain was unusually solid. The reliquary had been in continuous institutional custody. Napoleon's signed letter to Denon was preserved alongside the hairs. When scanning electron microscopy was applied to the beard hairs, researchers found the surface of each one still coated with microscopic iron debris and residual soap, the literal trace of the razor and the shaving ritual, which established that the hairs had been cut, not pulled, and that they had not been treated or altered in the centuries since. The material was genuine. What Lecotte's team found when they extracted and analyzed the Y chromosome, the portion of the genome passed exclusively from father to son across generations, was not expected to be remarkable. The assumption was that Napoleon, of Italian Corsican descent, would carry a Y haplogroup consistent with Southern European paternal lineages. The most common among Italian men are haplogroups R1b and G2a and J2, the inherited signatures of European Bronze Age migrations, of early Italic peoples, of populations that have been shaping the peninsula for 3,000 years. What the test showed was haplogroup E1b1b, subclade EM34. Lecotte ran the analysis again. The result held. He then compared against a Y-DNA profile of a living collateral male descendant, Prince Charles Napoleon Bonaparte, born in 1950, a fourth-generation descendant of Napoleon's youngest brother Jerome. That profile matched. The haplogroup designation was confirmed through cross-validation with two additional living descendants, one descended from the brother Lucien, and one from Napoleon's acknowledged illegitimate son, Alexander Kolonowski, whose paternity was itself confirmed by the same EM34 signature. The haplogroup was consistent across every branch of the male Bonaparte line. What it said about the geographic origins of that line was something else entirely. Before examining what haplogroup EM34 means in terms of ancestry geography, it is important to state directly what it does not mean, and to engage honestly with the strongest challenge to the interpretation of these findings. This is a legitimate challenge. It cannot be dismissed. The research team acknowledged it directly. Y haplogroup E1b1b is found in southern Europe, including in Sicily at approximately 7%, in Sardinia at 4%, in southern Italy and in Corsica itself, though at only 1.4% in Corsica specifically. Population geneticists have long documented that this haplogroup entered parts of the Mediterranean basin through prehistoric migrations from the Levant and North Africa, carried by Neolithic farmers moving westward by Phoenician maritime traders, and through the ancient Greek colonial networks that threaded the coastline of the Mediterranean for centuries before Rome. An Italian family of minor nobility, with roots on the Ligurian-Tuscan border, could plausibly carry this haplogroup through any one of these historical pathways without there being any direct or recent connection to the eastern Mediterranean. The Lecotte team acknowledged precisely this. They did not claim that Napoleon was ethnically North African or Middle Eastern in any simple or singular sense. What they documented was a position of Napoleon's specific Y chromosome within the haplogroup tree. Further sequencing work, published in 2015, refined the classification to E PH3893, a subclade whose time the most recent common ancestor, the point at which all modern carriers of the specific variant trace to a single male ancestor, was calculated at approximately 2,700 years before the present. That date corresponds to the Iron Age of the Levant and the Eastern Mediterranean. It is not prehistoric. It is not the Deep Neolithic. It is, in genetic terms, a relatively recent paternal ancestor existing at the edge of recorded history, living in a region where the EM34 branch carries its highest modern frequency, Jordan, Palestine, the Ethiopian Plateau, Yemen. This is where the two tracks converge. The documentary record had already noted something. The first Bonaparte to arrive in Corsica, Francesco, who came from Sarzana around 1490, bore a documented historical nickname. The records preserved in local archives called him the Moor of Sarzana. Napoleon himself knew this. On St. Helena, in one of his final conversations with his physician, he said, "My most remote ancestor, who inhabited Tuscany, had the principles that I profess." He was describing an ancestry he had inherited and never publicly claimed. This is where the two evidence tracks meet. The documentary track, the archival record of the Bonaparte family's migration from Sarzana to Corsica, the nickname attached to their first ancestor on the island, Napoleon's own private statement about his remotest forebear, and the genetic track, the Y haplogroup analysis, the subclade dating, The corroboration across 3 independent living male descendants are pointing in the same direction. They are doing so independently. Lucat's team was working from authenticated biological material. The archival historians who preserved the nickname, the Moor Sarzana, were recording a social label attached to a 15th century mercenary in a Genoese garrison. Neither team was coordinating with the other. Both found the same answer. The Bonaparte eternal line carries a genetic signature whose modern distribution is concentrated in the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Horn of Africa. The family's own recorded history includes a 15th century ancestor who bore a name that contemporaries use specifically to denote origin or appearance associated with North Africa and the Near East. These 2 data points, separated by 5 centuries of inquiry, converge on the same conclusion. There is one more detail in this body of evidence that almost nobody has cited publicly. The Lukat 2015 study on the Y chromosome sequence did not merely confirm the EM34 haplogroup. It calculated the time of most recent common ancestor, a Napoleon-specific subclade, at approximately 2,700 years before the present. This places the most recent common male ancestor of all carriers of Napoleon's exact paternal variant somewhere in the Iron Age Near East, roughly contemporary with the Phoenician expansion across the Mediterranean, with the consolidation of the ancient kingdoms of the Levant, with the period in which trading populations from the eastern shores of the Mediterranean were actively seeding genetic lineages across the coastal world. We will come back to that time frame in the next section. The Bonaparte family is still alive. The living male descendants who participated in this research, Charles Napoleon Bonaparte and others, did so voluntarily, and the findings belong to science, not to genealogical scandal. Whatever paternal haplogroup signifies about a deep ancestry, it does not alter the 2 centuries of verified history attached to their name. They carry a lineage that is simply older and longer than the European mythology surrounding it suggested. The concealment of Napoleon Bonaparte's ancestry was not, in the formal sense, a concealment at all. There was no document forged, no record deliberately destroyed, no conspiracy sustained across generations. What existed instead was something more common and, in its way, more interesting: the institutional manufacture of a usable past. When Napoleon engineered the coup of 18 Brumaire in November 1799 and began his transformation from first consul to emperor, the question of legitimacy became politically urgent. The old European monarchies derived their authority from dynastic lineage, from papal sanction, from centuries of inherited claims. Napoleon had none of these. He was a Corsican soldier of modest Italian family background who had risen through a revolution that had explicitly rejected the language of bloodlines and divine right. To crown himself emperor, as he did in December 1804, placing the crown on his own head before Pope Pius VII could do so, was to attempt the construction of a new legitimacy. And a new legitimacy required a new story of origins. The Napoleonic propaganda machine, managed in part by Denon himself, systematically reframed Napoleon's background within the idiom of European imperial grandeur. The family was described as noble. The Corsican was rendered French. The Italian surname was Gallicized. The art commissioned for the imperial court, including Jacques-Louis David's monumental paintings of the coronation and the Alpine crossing, depicted Napoleon within the visual vocabulary of Roman emperors and Carolingian kings. He was not a man from a small island off the coast of Liguria. He was, in the construction of his own mythology, the heir to Caesar. Napoleon's case is not unique in its structure. It is unique only in the prominence of the name attached to it. The early modern period in Europe produced hundreds of documented cases in which families of modest or ambiguous origin refashioned their genealogical identity upon achieving wealth, military success, or political power. Genealogists have a term for this pattern: pedigree laundering, the systematic reconstruction of a family tree to align with the social expectations of the class being entered rather than the class being left behind. What distinguished Napoleon's version was its scale. It was not a family that claimed a coat of arms. It was a man who claimed an empire, and into that empire he carried a Y chromosome that no amount of propaganda could alter. What does it mean to discover that the man who defined European modernity, who gave Europe its legal code, its administrative state, its secular educational system, its template for nationalist ambition, carried a paternal lineage whose deepest traceable roots lie not in France, not in Italy, but in the ancient Near East. It means several things, none of which should be offered as a verdict. It means that the story Europe told itself about Napoleon was, from the very beginning, an edited version. The name had been adjusted. The accent had been disciplined. The portrait had been composed by the greatest painters of the age to place him inside a tradition of European power that predated him by 1,000 years. And beneath all of it, traveling in the nucleotide sequences of his Y chromosome and confirmed to the beard hairs of a dead emperor, was a lineage that the mythology never mentioned and probably never knew. It means that the Napoleonic Code, still the legal foundation of dozens of nations across Europe, Latin America, and North Africa, was written by a man whose paternal ancestry connected him, genetically, to the very regions that European imperial law would spend the following 2 centuries attempting to govern, colonize, and define. There is something in that irony that resists easy reading. It means that the Napoleon who declared, "I am of the race that founds empires," was speaking a truth deeper than he understood. Haplogroup EM34, in its oldest traceable form, is associated with the Neolithic and Iron Age populations of Levant, the civilizations of the Fertile Crescent, the ancient agricultural societies of the Eastern Mediterranean that first developed the systems of grain storage, record-keeping, law, and urban administration from which all subsequent empires, including Napoleon's, ultimately descended. He was not wrong. He was just working from an incomplete map. In the Bertrand Museum of Châteauroux, in the right lateral compartment of the Vivant Denon reliquary, those beard hairs still rest in their gilded case, still carrying, at the cellular level, the answer to the question that no biographer thought to ask. The hairs are real. The signature is real. The letter is real. The story of where they came from is only now beginning to be fully read.